Ever wondered how to keep an audience engaged for 10 minutes? The biggest challenge with a 10-minute speech is that after about 2 minutes, if you haven't engaged your audience yet, they're most likely going to zone out for the remaining 8 minutes. And we don't want that. Now, I have given speeches of varying lengths, and 10-minute speeches are some of the most difficult because when you have 1 hour or 2 hours to speak, the preparation time is much lesser. You can say things in a lot more impromptu manner. You generally have slides supporting you. And a 10-minute speech is in that sweet spot where the audience still expects something quite meaningful, but you don't have enough time that a 1 hour speech holds to have that liberty with the content. So when I would sit down to write a speech of about 10 minutes, I would generally have some sort of a block, picking a topic if that wasn't given to me already, in writing down the actual flow of the speech. And every speech had a different rhythm to it, and there was no real structure to anything, which is why I had to start from scratch at every point. But after having gone through that entire journey and helping hundreds of our students with their own speech writing journey, we've come up with a framework that can help anybody write their own speech in a replicated fashion with different topics, different messages, and different purposes. So what is that framework? Let's get into it. By the way, if you're new here, we release public speaking content all the time. Subscribe to this channel if you like such content. So the very first thing is to pick your speech topic. If this is something that you've already been given or it's predetermined, then you can move ahead. But for some of us who find it hard to come up with a good speech topic for a 10-minute speech, remember there are 3 things we need to consider. The first is your audience. Within your audience, understand the basic demographics, their age, their geography, their gender, profession, so on and so forth. If you have a very diverse audience, in that case, take the majority of the audience and cater your speech towards them. You also want to try and understand what are the pain points and goals that these audience members have so that you can cater to those requirements in a much more targeted fashion. The second thing that you want is your through line. The through line is one idea that runs through the entire speech. Now, we have to pick this carefully because it literally makes the foundation, the heart of our entire talk. And when you're coming up with a through line, you want something that interests you, something that you have some credible experience with, but most importantly, it should have an element of unexpectedness to it. For example, don't just write a speech on the importance of hard work or the rise of artificial intelligence, topics that are spoken about a lot. Instead, you want a slightly different take on it. Take this speech as an example. It's called the paradox of choice. The through line that the speaker used was more choice actually makes us less happy. There's an element of unexpectedness to it in terms of the general norm of more choice, more happiness, more freedom. There's another example of one of the most famous speeches ever by Brene Brown. It's called the power of vulnerability. And in this speech, the speaker talks about how you can use vulnerability and treasure it instead of hiding from it. Both these speeches have received millions of views because of the power of the through line. So think about it, and what is the element of unexpectedness that you can have? And the third thing you need to keep in mind is the takeaway. Does your speech actually have something that the audience can act on, think about, or get inspired by? If not, then we're just giving information. We don't really have a speech. So first start by writing your audience, through line, and takeaway down. Then we get to the actual speech writing. The first element over here is the hook. The hook is the first line or the first few lines of your speech. Remember we spoke earlier that your audience will zone out after 2 minutes? The hook is where it begins. If the hook is strong, the audience is much more likely to stick on. Now, what's a good hook exactly? You can do something where you use an unusual prop to catch the audience unexpectedly, like what Darren Tay did in his World Championship of Public Speaking speech. But that example is a little too out there for most of us. A great way to start your speech is through a question, just like how we started this video. Ever wondered how to keep an audience engaged for 10 minutes? You can also start by giving a promise, like this speaker.
I'm a gamer, so I like to have goals. I like special missions and secret objectives. So here's my special mission for this talk. I'm going to try to increase the lifespan of every single person in this room by 7.5 minutes. Literally, you will live 7.5 minutes longer than you would have otherwise just because you watch this talk.
Whatever it is, the point of a good hook is to intrigue your audience. The more you can intrigue them, the more curiosity you can evoke in them, the longer they are to stick with you through your speech. That's the first element. The second element becomes, now we get into the actual writing of the body of the speech. Here, we want to remember that we're giving a speech, we're not giving just information. That's where we have to utilize the elements of storytelling. And I know it's very easy to say, oh, you should use storytelling, it's much more powerful, blah, blah, blah. But how do you go about using storytelling effectively in speech writing? Especially in a 10-minute speech, there is one storytelling framework which you can utilize. This framework is called the nested loops framework. It's a framework, technique, whatever you want to call it. It basically means we have, instead of one story, 3 different stories. Each of them seem quite unrelated, but have one common thing running through them all, which is revealed at the end of the 3rd story. So you have all 3 stories, and then the takeaway is just one point which is common to all 3 of them. A fantastic example of this is Steve Jobs' Stanford commencement address, one of the best speeches of all time. In it, he literally says, I'm going to just tell you 3 stories, it's no big deal. And he takes us through his life journey and how all those 3 stories led him to where he is today. And basis those 3 stories, he provides a takeaway for the audience. Another example to this is a TED talk by this lady called Ideate, a very, very powerful speaker who spoke about how she faced racism in a very subtle format at 3 different stages of her life. Some were subtle, some were not. But the point she made at the end is how we can look at different perspectives instead of looking at just one single story. It's a great way to utilize your time effectively. It can work for a 10-minute, 15-minute, or even a 20-minute speech. If you haven't checked out both these speeches, please do so. Another thing to keep in mind whenever you're writing these stories, whether it's just one big story or you use the nested loops technique and use 3 small stories, every story should have 3 elements: a goal, a conflict, and a solution. The goal is, what does the hero or heroine of the story want to achieve, whether it's you or somebody else. The conflict is what's coming in their way to achieve that goal, and hence what solutions do they take to overcome it. A great way to utilize nested loops within this framework is that we leave the solution for the end. We just talk about the goal and the problem, the conflict at hand. So that keeps the audience hooked on for longer for the end of the speech. So if I, for example, were writing a speech around the dangers of remote work for the youth, I can start by telling one story about when I started my job, my career initially. There was no COVID, there was no pandemic. So I could actually go to work, but how I wish I had had more face time with the bosses to take more of an advantage with the situation. The second story could be about when the pandemic hit and I was forced to stay at home and how that stunted my learning curve. I was just stuck to a laptop. And the third story could be now that I've left my job and I'm doing my own thing, and how it's my decision whether I want to go to office, whether I want to call people to office or not. And the solution at the end for all these 3 stories is how can we find a middle ground and take certain steps towards helping people get the comfort of working from home without sacrificing on the exposure, networking, and learning that they can have by being in the office. That's a raw example to give you a sense of how nested loops can work. And finally, you want to have a strong conclusion. The conclusion is something that can really tie your speech together. And my favorite way to end with a conclusion that puts across your takeaway very clearly is to end with a question. Check out these 2 examples back.
So I guess I'd like to pose that question to you. If you could control somebody's attention, what would you do with it? Thank you.
Ask yourselves, how uncomfortable are you willing to become in order to reach your fullest potential? Thank you.
And that's about it. Once you follow these steps, you'll have a strong 10-minute speech. But what's important to keep in mind, it's not about just writing the speech. People are going to judge you a lot more on the delivery of the speech. That's where things like your voice modulation and tonality become extremely important. We've created an entire video on your tonality, which I highly recommend you check out right after this, right here.